are from the brother.
So where's the?
Oh, it's a hand.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Got it.
Hello. Is this working?
No.
You're good. Hello? Okay, you gotta talk into it like this. Anyway, I'm gonna pull up my notes here. Sorry.
Is there a way to dim this light up here?
We tried for like an hour.
Got it. It's fine.
So, hello, thank you all for coming to our lecture and discussion with Dr. Clay Fuller of the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Thomas Kenna, and I'm a junior here at American, affiliated with both our co-sponsoring organizations. So if you don't mind, let me take a moment to tell you about AEI Executive Council. Works to advance campus dialogue about public policy and introduce students and faculty to the scholarship of the American Enterprise Institute. AEI is a Washington-based, nonpartisan research think tank committed to defending human dignity and expanding human potential, and in building a freer, safer world through rigorous public policy. Dr. Clay Fuller is a Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on authoritarian survival, corruption, and the means through which dictators, terrorists, and criminals use free markets to restrict freedom, sow discord, and legitimize their actions. He also collects data on the use of special economic zones and sovereign wealth funds in non-democratic countries. Previously, Dr. Fuller taught international relations, American government, and modern dictatorships, among other courses at the University of South Carolina, Western Carolina University, Midlands Technical College, and Texas State University. Dr. Fuller has been published in peer-reviewed journals. He is currently working on a book titled The Economic Foundations of Authoritarian Rule. His forthcoming studies include the who and the how of authoritarian rule and the rise of authoritarian liberalism. Dr. Fuller has 4 degrees in political science, a PhD and an MA from the University of South Carolina, another MA from Texas State University, and a BA from West Virginia State College. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Clay Fuller.
Thank you, Thomas. So I don't do anything boring. 4 degrees, wow, that was odd to hear. Don't do that. It's a lot of student debt. But anyway, so I'm Clay Fuller. I've been in DC for a year now. I'm originally from Austin, Texas. Came out here from South Carolina. I'm actually working on a report right now that's called Defeating the Authoritarian Corruption Nexus, which is where I'm trying to sort of come together and explain how modern authoritarianism has changed, and it's different than Cold War authoritarianism. It's different from Jeane Kirkpatrick, who my fellowship is named after, famously wrote about the difference between traditional autocrats and communist autocrats. It's totalitarianism and traditional autocracy. She argued that the communist totalitarianism was far greater danger, and that we should work with traditional autocrats in order to get rid of the totalitarian autocrats. And well, that worked. Right? The Soviet Union is gone. The communist totalitarians are largely no more. And so now we're faced with this dispersed and diverse threat of traditional autocrats all around the world that are ideologically diverse and geographically dispersed. So I'm working on that, and today I'm going to sort of talk about a sort of a way of getting to talking about this, because every single one of those words up there is very contentious. I bet you I could ask every single one of you what a democracy is, and I'd get a different answer out of every single one of you. Same thing for dictatorship, same thing for corruption. All right, since this is like what I have been doing for the past year, I'm going to sort of try to explain my sort of thoughts on talking about contentious ideas like this. So I'm going to start with some definitions, because I think it was yesterday I read in the New York Times somebody calling Margot Rubio an autocrat in waiting. I'm sure it'll only be a matter of weeks before a conservative columnist calls Nancy Pelosi an autocrat in waiting. And we've all heard talk of Donald Trump's famous corruption, right? This is what's all over the news. So I want to create a sort of like objective way of looking and thinking about these things, because I don't think it helps our discourse or our understanding about anything to just use these terms as name-calling techniques. So I'm going to attempt this. For a democracy, right? They're determined by, you know it's a democracy if there are uncertain political outcomes, as opposed to an autocracy or a dictatorship where you have predictable or fixed political outcomes. So if you watch the midterm elections, right, everybody probably watched, if you guys are nerds like I am, right, and sit and love this stuff and watch it, you know, I was watching the Texas race, I was watching the Florida race, it's like, who's going to win, right? We didn't know. There's uncertainty, right? That's how you know there's democracy. That's how you know there's democracy there. I can predict pretty well, I think, who's going to win the 2019 North Korean elections. I think we all can pretty much predict that. I think we all know which party is going to win the Chinese elections coming up, right? This is a core difference between the two systems of governance, right? In democracies versus autocracies, you also have this focus on individual rights in democracies versus collective rights in dictatorships. And so democracies always focus on freedom of speech. These are individual rights: freedom of speech, freedom of property, freedom of movement, freedom of press. These are all sort of individual-based rights. Whereas authoritarian regimes on the left and the right focus on collective rights, you know, whether it's fascist nationalism or whether it's socialism, right? There's always this heavy government focus on the collective rights of groups over individuals within them. In democracies, you also have due process, transparency over that process, and whatever the rule of law is, which is this sort of mushy concept, but we all sort of know what it is, which is related to due process and transparency, right? And these all stem out from those individual rights as well, as opposed to a dictatorship where you have opaque processes, where, you know, it's really hard for me to tell. I've been trying to dig out the new law in the United Arab Emirates over terrorist financing, and the one in Bahrain as well, but I'm not allowed to read it, right? But if you want to read the United States counterterrorism financing laws, they're all over the internet, right? There's 200, 300-page documents, you can look them up and read all of them, so there's like this sort of transparency over how the process works and what it is. And what happens in dictatorships is this creates what I call legal monopolies, really, where you have a political monopoly on power, right? Where you have one group, one person, one something that has all the rights. And Milan Zvolik in The Politics of Authoritarian Rule talks about this opaqueness and the lack of an independent arbiter. If you think about it, like individual rights, due process, a free press, all those things, an independent judiciary is an independent arbiter, right? So if you have a grievance with the government, you go to that independent arbiter. In a dictatorship, if you don't have those independent arbiters and you have a grievance with the government, or a government has a grievance with itself, guess what it does? It turns to violence, usually. And this is why we typically have violent outcomes coming out of authoritarian regimes. This is why democracies don't fight each other. This is why authoritarian regimes fight each other, and democracies fight authoritarian regimes. This is also why you have the highest rates of genocide, forced migration, human rights abuses, all these things all coming out of authoritarian regimes because of this lack of an independent arbiter. So enough of the dark, gloomy stuff. Sometimes teaching about dictatorships, right? It's like you have to like lighten yourself up a little bit. So I'll show some graphs and tell a story, because my boss, Arthur Brooks, talks about this a lot, about how people tend to remember stories a lot more than they remember facts or arguments or anything else. So I came to Washington, D.C. about a year ago and started at AEI, sat down, they offered me a job, I decided I was going to forego my teaching jobs at these other state universities around the country. For some reason, AEI loved what I did and what I was writing about and decided to offer me a job. And so I had like these like my mentors and people I'd been reading a lot of my life, like sitting down at a table around me, offered me a job, and I'm just trying not to smile too big. And so I asked Danielle Pleka and Nicholas Eberstadt and Gary Schmidt and Paul Wolfowitz, like, what will I be doing here? And kind of like shakily, because I didn't know how think tank world worked. I didn't know how DC worked. I'm a Southerner, and they all look at me and say, whatever you want. And I say, yeah, no, really, what will I be doing here? This is a 2-year term. And they said, no, literally, whatever you want. I was like, okay. I was like, well, so what do you guys do here? And they all sort of sat back and looked around and laughed. We ask ourselves that a lot, all the time. And so I was just like, okay, I'll take the job. I picked up my family and moved to Washington, D.C., and we moved into that beautiful building down there. The nicest building, came from a state university, the nicest building I've been in. Long time, they feed us a 5-star lunch every day. Sitting at my desk, and like, so what am I going to do? And so naturally, of course, I was like, I'll start a Twitter account and learn how Twitter works. Never done that. All through graduate school, I'd been spending all my time reading. I never took the time to really learn how Twitter worked. And seeing how Donald Trump was now our president, and Twitter is like the foreign policy tool of the 21st century, somehow, I figured I'd start an account and figure out how it works. So I started a Twitter account, got on there, started looking around, looking at other political scientists, looking at data, stuff I was interested in. Found this guy, Jay Ulfelder, who used to be like a blogger and a professor. And he had this graph up of data that just looked really cool. I've always been really into data visualizations. And I looked at it and I was like, you know what, that graph seems to show about a 20-year expansion in democracy. And it was like, wait a minute, I've spent the past like 5, 6, 10 years reading Democracy in Decline and Authoritarianism Goes Global and everything that Freedom House has been writing about democracy in crisis, and I've been reading, Levitsky and Ziblatt's book and looking at the news and everything, and I was like, wait a minute, everything within the 10-mile square of DC tells me that democracy is dying and declining, and here's this graph that says that it's been expanding for the past 20 years. So I DM'd him and said, hey, it looks like this graph says that democracy is expanding. Is that really what you found? And he was like, yeah, here's the link to where the data is, go check it out. And I was like, cool. And so I downloaded it and started playing around with it in Stata, and I was like, wow, it really does show that. So I started reading the code book and started figuring out how they came about doing it. And AEI has a great graphics department, right? So I took them the data and I was like, hey, can you recreate this graph just like in a really cool, sleek way? And I went about, and this is what Jay's graph looked like somewhat, except he had a bunch of different colors in it, and it was a little more difficult to read. But you can see it shows this change. If you divide, there's 16 different forms of government here, spread out from 1950 to 2018. This comes from the One Earth Future Foundation, which I don't think they created this data set to try and prove that democracy was doing well. They actually did it to help predict coups and to work on maritime safety and stuff, but then I took it and used it for this. But the way they categorize the regimes using the Getty's Right France Authoritarian Institutions data set. So this is a 2014 data set. You can look it up, GWF 2014. And it goes through and it creates a bunch of different subgroups for all this. So the personalist military regime, the personalist party military regime, all this other type of stuff. And what OEF did was they went through and they used that and combined it with some other, the Shavorsky work on regimes, and created this data set. And then I just applied it in this visual way and said, what the heck is going on? And I was like, wait a minute, so everybody in DC must be wrong, right? And I'm the only person that knows that they're all wrong. And I was like, yeah, I wrote a 500-word blog, I think, for AEI ideas. that became one of the most viewed blog posts I think that they had in a while. But I'm a naturally curious person. I'm not big on blogging or anything like that. I'm not here to become famous or anything. I consider myself to actually be a scientist. We were talking about theory earlier and humanities and stuff. I don't consider myself to be a historian. I consider myself to be a scientist. So history informs science, right? But that's why I focus on the modern era. So being naturally curious, I'm like, well, this is just the percentage of countries around the world, right? What about the population? Well, so I went through and did that, and looked into it. And the interesting thing about the OEF data is that instead of by country year, they do it by country month. So you can actually get down and dive down deeper into where these sort of risks are. But so here's the world global population according to these data, right? You know, like data is not always like representative, which I'm going to talk about. But here's the population of the world. And then I was like, what about regions? And I'm like, oh, well, the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa tend to, you know, not be very democratic, so what about them? Oh, well, it looks like it's expanding there too. Wow. Oh, Eastern Europe, East Asia, Southeast Asia, you see the dominant party or single party communist regimes and post-communist regimes are dominant in the region, but you still see an expansion of democracy. So what in the world is going on? Well, so everybody measures democracy a little bit differently, right? You're probably familiar with the Freedom House. This is the Economist Intelligence Unit. So they tend to focus on political rights and civil rights, freedom of the press, these other more specific aspects of democracy, whereas Polity and OEF, or the Gettysburg France, tend to focus more on elections. Right, so you might know this more as like the minimalist and the maximalist definitions of democracy. The minimalist ones is more just like elections based, where the maximalist ones includes all these things like civil liberties and individual rights. So the ones that are greater, stricter, right? Freedom House shows a democracy in crisis. The Economist Intelligence Unit shows that democracy is declining as well. But polity by population and by number of regimes, if you combine anocracies and autocracies to be non-democracies, tend to show that democracies are actually doing pretty well. They're slowly sort of getting better. And so this all begs the question, like, what in the world is really going on, right? Who do we listen to? Why are people telling us stuff like this? And so my explanation is that democracy doesn't exist. It's perceived. Right, democracy isn't like this chair. It's not going to disappear. Right, it's not a tree that's going to die over time or anything like that. It's something that's perceived through the people that live in a different country. So it's going to change over time. This is sort of a constructivist sort of viewpoint or argument. But so declinist findings or expansionist findings or growth findings, whatever, they're all going to be determined by the methodologies. Right? This is something you learn if you study comparative elections, right? It's the election method that actually determines the outcome, right? You know, like it's the single-member district first-past-the-post system that creates two parties in the United States, right? It's not the fact that there's only two viable sets of ideas or platforms. It's the electoral structure of our government that creates the outcome of having a two-party system. So the same way, by defining democracy in different ways, you go out and try and measure it, you come up with different outcomes. But in my view, from looking at this from this perspective for a long time, what I've found is that democracy, however you want to define it, or according to my definition that I gave you before, has largely stayed about average, the same since the end of the Cold War. Hasn't expanded much more, hasn't weakened, it's sort of there. And I see all this declinism as sort of a panic attack kind of, and a sort of a loss of confidence or a wandering in the wilderness of the Western order in this post-Cold War era, because we don't have this big communist bogeyman to compare ourselves to or fight against. But so I think it's staying about the same. And there are other people. Levitsky and Way wrote a piece in 2015 that looked at all the measures and found the same sort of thing. that it's staying steady. We're not in collapse. And Stephen Levitsky will still say the same thing today. But one observation that I pulled out of this that I've tried to highlight that I think is a strategic advantage of the West, of democracy, of freedom, of whatever you want to call it, is that elections in the post-Cold War era are now a norm all around the world. Another constructivist sort of argument, right? But they're a norm, right? Like all the rulers of the world base some part of their legitimacy on elections, no matter how rigged they are, no matter how fake they are, no matter how one-sided, slanted, not free and fair, they still base their legitimacy on elections. That's a big change, right? That's a big norm change that has happened in the past 30 years or so that has gone largely unnoticed. And I give this sort of extreme example. It would be almost as if like we one day woke up and families decided they were going to decide who the father is by voting. Right? No matter how rigged the father could make the voting among the family or whatever, but the family is going to decide by voting who the father is rather than something like that's a big change that we haven't noticed that I think goes. This is why I tend to like election monitoring stuff and the work on that. The other one is that markets now occur everywhere. So markets have always existed everywhere. If you read Mansur Olson, Mansur Olson is one of my ideological heroes, or my not ideological, academic heroes. The Logic of Collective Action, and especially Power and Prosperity is my favorite one from 2000, about why the Soviet Union collapsed. But so in the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've moved markets all around the world. So now we have 24-hour stock markets that run all around the world. You can buy stuff and talk to people and move in. This is something that is new, and it's an advantage because democracies built the financial system that maintains all of that. Right? We have the advantage of being the original designers. So moving on from that, any questions so far? Maybe, write them down. No. Telling another good story to get to, since you have IR, the big IR crowd, I gotta slam on Mearsheimer for a minute here. When I was in graduate school, I was president of the Graduate Student Association, and we put on a graduate student conference, and I asked Donald P. Green from Columbia University to come be our keynote speaker. And he's like the founder of experimental methods in political science, doing field experiments, going out survey experiments, all this stuff, and he's like one of the big pushers of this. And this is the difference between observational data and experimental data, right? So observational data, you can only just observe what you've done and do correlational econometrics on it and stuff. The thing is with international relations, and I think when Donald Green came and spoke to everybody, I think half the faculty's jaws dropped when he said this. But what he started out with was he said, the sciences, all the sciences over the ages have progressed by finding stubborn little facts. Stubborn little facts that just won't go away. Right? So you wash your hands and then you don't spread germs. Right? Built the whole medical field. Right? Or gravity, right? Built the whole physics field out, right? And so what he's arguing is that political science is sort of at this nascent sort of area where we're still searching for those stubborn little facts. And he argues that you can only do that by doing experiments. Because you have to have a treatment group and a comparison group, right? And that's the only way that you can really find these stubborn little facts. Well, those of us who study international relations have kind of a problem, right? Because there's no counterfactual to a Iraq war, right? There's no counterfactual to a World War II. There's no counterfactual to a 9/11, right? You can't see what a non-9/11 world looked like or anything. So you can't have you can't test like that. So what he said was, if you work in international relations, you might as well just tell a good story because you can't prove anything. And everybody was like, huh. And I was like, huh, okay. So that sort of stuck with me. My advisors weren't very happy with me, but I found it interesting. I didn't really care. But this leads to, I went to the American Political Science Association meeting in Boston a few months ago. I went to a panel with Dan Dresner, John Mearsheimer, and a few others, and Dan Dresner was hilarious as always. And Mearsheimer went off on his long rant about liberal hegemony and social engineering and all this sort of stuff. But then he came and he looked right at me, and he said, the competition of ideas is fake. That there's no such thing as a difference between democracy and autocracy. I don't know where you people get off in thinking that there's a difference between these two, but they're fake. And it's just liberal elites in Washington manipulating the media to make you believe whatever it is they want you to believe the same way they do in autocracies. And I was just taken aback, like, I didn't know what to say, because I've read all of Mearsheimer's stuff. I've always admired him, liked his work, and and familiar, and have taught it and everything. But this was really sort of odd, which leads me to my next point of why I became an academic. So I told some of you guys I took 10 years off after high school. I got kicked out of high school. I became an academic because I don't like authority. I don't like it at all. So I decided I was going to sort of study it. And so after years of reading about anarchy and learning about it, I found out that anarchy actually is a form of dictatorship. Right? So in anarchy, you actually you put on the all-black uniform and wave the black and white flat red flag, and you march and you take your orders the same way you do in a nationalist fascist dictatorship. It's just different sides of the spectrum. And so I spent 10 years studying only modern dictatorships because I wanted to understand how to get to that just right sauce, right? That just right democracy in the middle, right? In between all that, where you can have freedom, where you can have liberty, right, but without all the authority. Does that make sense? And so when Mearsheimer said that, I was like, whoa, something's way off here. And this is where with the sort of, I think, this is what I was saying before, don't tell any of your advisors or anybody I said this, but I think the realism, liberalism paradigms are worthless. I think they're not applicable to the modern world, and this is why we're getting everything wrong in foreign policy, is because we're thinking about these things in these antiquated ways that worked during the Cold War, but the Cold War's been over for a long time, and the world looks a lot different now today. And so I have this argument that I think we need a sort of global comparative politics. Right, so this is looking at global trends like democracy and dictatorship without focusing on the specific region, but looking at the entire globe, because we're all connected through the economy and the internet now and everything, and this is happening exponentially faster because of technologies and exponential technologies like AI and everything coming down the line. And so we need to be studying how the internal politics of governments work around the world, but with a global perspective of it. So that's my sort of story, and now I'm going to show you some more graphs. So at the end of graduate school, I ended up, my advisor Harvey Starr introduced me to Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith. Have you ever heard of selectorate theory? Do you study that here? Should. It's a very interesting, it's a 500-page book, about 250 pages of it is math. It's published by MIT Press in 2003. There's a popular version of it called the Dictators Handbook, why bad behavior always ends up in good results for dictators. But the shorthand of the selectorate theory is it's a sort of way to comparatively look at the world. So if you have two different types of countries, and this really goes for countries, but it can apply to any hierarchical human organization. business, a corporation, any type of hierarchy, a family, anything. But where you have one where the leader in the middle has a large group of people that he depends upon for his survival as the leader, right? It leads him to different strategies than when he's in a situation, him or her, is in a situation where there's a small group that they depend upon for survival, right? So where you have a situation where you have one person that depends on a comparatively large group, they tend to go for public goods like national defense, like education, like tax cuts, like healthcare, right? And then they tend to have some kind of transparency, right? Because the large group wants to know, well, how are you distributing these? And they want to demand all this information and know it. So this leads to very different sort of nation-state level outcomes when you have that type of structure. Whereas in this type, where you have one leader with a small group that he has to keep happy to stay in power, it leads into the strategy of using private goods, yachts, cash, drugs, all sorts of anything that's a private good that can be moved to bribe loyalty from those people. And then it leads to secrecy, because guess what? You don't want the rest of these people out here to find out the stuff that you're giving these people for their loyalty. But they might get mad and pick up pitchforks and come for your head, which they do very frequently when they find out. So it leads to these very unstable, cyclical nature that ends up in violence and instability. This is why established democracies are so much more stable, wealthier, stronger than dictatorships, because dictatorships will always lead back down to this path. Using these, remember back to my basic definition of democracy and dictatorship. So again, I always turn to the data to look for it, right? You see this trend here. In this cool graph, which I have to credit the AEI graphics department, again, these shaded squares in the back are the individual observations of countries by year, and then the lines are the averages for dictatorships and democracies, divided by Freedom House for free and not free, leaving out the middle regimes here. But I've tried this with every single type of measure of corruption and freedom that there is out there. I've used the polity measures, I've used the Jaworski dichotomous measures, I've used every single measure that Varieties of Democracy has for corruption, the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, and this trend is the same. There's a clear separation on average between democracies and dictatorships on levels of corruption, no matter how you define corruption, no matter how you define dictatorship or democracy, and all the data that you find out there. And then on top of that, you find in the post-Cold War era, democracy stays the same, but dictatorship has a spike and more and greater corruption. And I have a hunch, I'm working it out theoretically in the writing, that this is due to ideological decline, right? The fall of the Soviet Union, it's when you cannot capture people with the ideas of an ideology anymore, a full collective ideology like that, then you have to resort to, giving your oligarchs yachts and things to go out, and then people see that, right? And so they perceive it, so it shows up in the data more. So almost done. I hope you aren't falling asleep yet, or am I talking too fast, or okay. I'll give you some more definitions. So getting to the last one with corruption. This is one of my favorites. Because corruption is something different. It's in the eye, I call it, it's something that's in the eye of the victim, right? I mean, I had my students, when I'd give them a D or an F, they'd be like, "You corrupt dictator." They still say that. There's an interesting poll that just came out. I forgot who did it, but they were looking at satisfaction with democracy, and I about jumped up and down screaming, punching myself in the face when I went through and found the first major finding of this big expensive poll was that party affiliation is the #1 indicator of how happy you are with democracy or not in the United States. This is just for the United States. It's like, yeah, duh. It's because democracy creates winners and losers, right? And people, anyways. So corruption is one of my other ones I like to get at. So for the last year, I've been going around DC trying to explain this to policymakers and stuff in different ways. And most of them look at me like I'm crazy, like what in the world are you talking about? Because nobody ever goes and talks to policymakers about stuff like this, right? Well, I mean, people do, but maybe not in the way I do. But so Transparency International, who I've been meeting with a lot, they have the most basic definition of corruption that most people are familiar with, which is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, right? And so I go to all these meetings all the time, and they're talking about anti-corruption campaigns, why you have all these anti-corruption treaties, why doesn't anybody follow them, and I'm like, that's great, corruption sucks, I hate it too, like, let's try and define it or whatever, and then I started thinking about it, and it's like, well, wait a minute, for anti-corruption, like, what is it that we're for? Like, corruption exists everywhere. Right? Like I said, corruption is in the eye of the beholder. Right? So maybe if you want to attack something, maybe you should have something that you're fighting for in the campaign. I always ask people, like, so what's the opposite of corruption? And people, I always get these like dumbfounded look, like, I don't know, rule of law? Okay, well, what's rule of law? Democracy? What's democracy? Here we go. This is why I'm talking about this stuff. So what I did was I just sort of flipped the words around, right? Instead of the abuse, I say the use. Instead of entrusted, I say earned. And instead of private, I say public. Getting back, thinking to the selectorate theory and use of private goods versus public goods around that as well. So the opposite of corruption would be the use of earned power for public gain, which is what we should be promoting in anti-corruption campaigns, if we really want to win them. And so this is synonymous almost with private enterprise, right? So this is, I hate to say it, Jeff Bezos, right? Earning a lot of power and then doing a lot for the public gain of Northern Virginia and wherever HQ3 is going to be or whatever. But this is any business owner, right, who earns enough power to hire employees to provide a service for a community, right, is the use of earned power for public gain. This is capitalism in general, markets. But it's not just that, right? It's the media as well. If a media outlet works really hard to earn reputational power of being a trusted news source or good news source, they can use that for the public gain of spreading knowledge to a polity, or with an educational student place like this fine university, right? Works very hard to earn their reputation and spread this. So this is how we fight corruption. So you're welcome. I've just solved all your problems and the world's problems in 31 minutes. But so the conclusion is that essentially, if you don't want democracy to decline, if you want to defeat authoritarianism, we have to address corruption. And I have several ideas on sort of how to do that. But this is a very different way of looking at the world than looking at it as, oh, we have to uphold the liberal world order, or oh, we have to retrench and make America first, or oh, we have to, the realist liberal sort of arguments there between that. And so with that, I'll do the sort of DC thing and sort of like promote self-promotion. Well, the lights turned off when I said that. Maybe it's just change it. But happy to answer any questions and have a discussion if you want. Yes.
So what's the standard on which the use of earned public gain,
Earned power.
yes, that, I had it written down, and apparently my brain is momentarily...
Earn power for public
Yes,
gain.
Yes.
What's this?
What's the standard on which that is measured for non-political things, such as the power of a business owner or the media? Because right now we have as an illustration media that is blatantly dishonest but trusted by many.
Yeah, so I don't have an answer for that. That's for you to decide. That's for everybody to sort of figure out. I mean, there are plenty of metrics. This is where you'll find whatever the liar pants on fire or whatever all the fact checkers or whatever there are all sorts of metrics and things that can be used to go about and get at these things and try to gain how much has the public actually gained from this, or how much has the public actually been harmed by it. But there's no silver bullet for it, because things are always going to be changing, right? This is the thing with democracy, and especially democracy crisis, right? Is that democracy is always in crisis. It's supposed to be, and this is because we're constantly figuring it out. This is why somebody asked Robert Kagan the other day when we were talking, asked about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. And I always had this, I wrote my master's thesis on Dubai. It was a case study of Dubai. It was capitalism without democracy. And basically the conclusion that I came to is that capitalism is a necessary but not sufficient condition for democracy. So you cannot have a democracy that's not capitalist, but you can have a non-democracy that is capitalist. And so that's sort of the general finding out of that. But capitalism and democracy themselves work together hand in hand because they're constantly changing. Creative destruction, Schumpeterian creative destruction, right? Things fail and get rebuilt all the time, and we change our minds on things. And I think they just made marijuana legal in 10 more states. I mean, it's things change, right? So only democracy can handle that. Authoritarianism is too rigid.
So with democracy,
Go ahead. You can finish your question.
okay, with democracy being as fluid as it is, doesn't that sort of break the mold for what should be stable? I mean, if you have more change, you have more instability, and taking I like Schmitter and Carl, bounded uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that then go outside the bounds and create the conditions for more upheaval, which I think would then really damage institutions more than it would preserve them?
Possibly. But this is where you get with disruptive technologies, right? In economies, sometimes they have good effects, sometimes they have bad effects, right? But so it's about, this is where the sort of rule, law, and due process come in, right? For trying to bound the uncertainty to some level. But it's that happy medium that I talked about a little bit, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my question was going to be what your opinion of if America is a democracy, and you were talking about how we need to find that happy medium between anarchy and authoritarianism, and just what is the role of government in the United States, and how would you consider it, what about it is a democracy and what about it is kind of not?
I'm glad you didn't use the word republic.
Yeah.
Because that's what usually gets shouted at me all the time. So I always turn to the data on questions like these, right? So lots of data sets don't count the United States as a democracy until 1920, when we allowed women to vote, as a part of what the definition of democracy is. Some don't count it as a democracy until after the Civil War. Some don't count as a democracy until after the Civil Rights Movement. So people have differing opinions on that in general. I tend to take the approach that Adam Przeworski takes with it, who in one of my favorite books wrote Democracy and Development. He wrote that democracy is sort of like being pregnant. Can't be half pregnant. You're either a democracy or you're not. So again, it's perceived by the individual person, like again, which goes back to it. I would say it's a democracy. It's also a democratic republic. It's also a Republican democracy. It's also a liberal democracy. It's also a very unequal and stubborn place, but also a very sharing and giving and loving place. It's a very peaceful and aggressive at the same time. It's sort of a whole bunch of things. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but maybe what was the specific
No, just
question?
like elaborating on my question a little bit, just like there are, I think, a few elements within our government, within our country that are not like truly wholly democratic.
Right, like the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah, like the Supreme Court or
I can't stand unelected judges.
yeah, or just any unelected position or just like bureaucracy.
Is the bureaucracy
Yeah.
that's growing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Yasha Monk writes a lot about this, right, and the different parts, the unelected, undemocratic part. This gets to the sort of, this is why democracy is more than elections. Right, so the decline part would maybe, the decline measures that we find would probably reflect the expanding non-democratic elements of our democracies. God, I hate getting into this part of it. But the thing is like there's creative destruction that goes along with that as well. So I've actually been working on sort of trying to come up with legislation ideas to actually deal with this. So we can go through it. I mean, I would agree that that lots of parts of the United States government could be reined in. I also think there's places where democracy could be expanded. Like my first dissertation idea was that I thought the House of Representatives should have 6,000 members. I thought that would go along more with the intention of the Constitution. And I also thought that the Senate, the 17th Amendment, should be repealed and connected back to the states in order to follow along with that, right? But so these are not like exactly very popular ideas, but they're supported by people on the left and the right on differing times of the election cycle, depending on who's in power. And so I ended up abandoning them and just going to other ideas instead. I've also proposed ideas about the Supreme Court, where I think we should actually have more justices. I think we should have regional justices that are elected, along with the appointed ones, which is another crazy idea, right? But people come up with these over time, right? And they actually get enacted, and things do change. So just because we might sort of be in a like steady state or declining, or maybe, I call it wandering in the wilderness, that doesn't make me not hopeful for the future of it.
I think people always just
follow us this one real quick.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, I think that people just see that, like, so obviously when our government got started, when we got away from Britain, like we had many tweaks and Articles of Confederation didn't work, and we had to, go through that. We've always had many tweaks to our government, but we've kind of got to this place
Hated the
now.
king so much we created a government without an executive.
Yeah. But so we've got to this place where our government has run a certain way for a long time, and I think new thinking in government is kind of just pushed by the wayside by bureaucrats, by these people who are in these positions that they're not elected in, and they just want to see government run one certain way. So I do like to see that you're thinking of new ideas, and that's like...
Right, so what I'm trying to, thank you. what I'm trying to say is that like, so it's not helpful for us to start calling each other dictators and other things, which is why I sort of started out with that, to move the conversation forward, because a lot of it, and this is what we work on a lot in AEI, is about like sort of improving our discourse around how we talk about all this stuff, because it really is a competition of ideas. You know, Mearsheimer, I respect him, but you know, like, no, there really is a competition of ideas, and that's what matters, and that needs to be brought back. If we put that away, then democracy goes away. It's a good question.
So I was going to ask something else, but I want to ask you about the Supreme Court idea. I have a professor right now, and we're talking about this idea of elected courts.
Yeah, there's a good literature on it out there.
Yeah, he's an EU law scholar, so they have a bit of a different set of rules.
We elect our judges in Texas.
Yeah. So my question is, in terms of rule of law, we've talked about how it's an abstract concept, but from how I perceive rule of law, at least part of the definition is that there's checks and balances.
Yep.
And I think most people would agree with that. So if we were to have elected judges, do you believe that there would be a possible erosion of rule of law because judges would feel swayed and wouldn't be as impartial as they are right now? And we would lose some of that rule of law in democracy.
One, I don't have the specific answer, and I'm not a judicial scholar, and don't tell anybody in my department that I ever commented on this, because there's a bunch of judicial, and Don Songer and a bunch of other people were in my department, and we're specialists on courts. I don't think any judges are impartial. I just don't believe that, ever. I think most decisions, I mean, the judges are really smart and they can do that, but it can really come down to what the judge ate for breakfast that morning, or if they got in a fight with their spouse, whatever. The Supreme Court, you know, like so it's all about more, I'm an institutionalist, in that the institutional design has effects on it. So there's the legalistic framework, and then there's the, what's the other judicial one? There's the legal framework and the partisan.
Judicial activism?
No, it's the major theory of judicial behavior, where they vote according to their political beliefs. So there's one where you vote based on precedent only, and there's one where you vote on whether you're a liberal or a conservative. And the major consensus is that on the Supreme Court, most justices use a little bit of both, depending on what the case is, depending on going back and forth. But still, either they're biased to precedent or they're biased to their own political preferences. And so it's more about what the structure of the court is, in my opinion. So I think there's ways to, like, my whole criticism has always been that there's a lack of creativity and thinking about institutions out there. And like, we have a lot of really powerful tools and a lot of really good literature out there showing, the literature I'm referring to is on state justices, because a lot of the states elect, and so they found sort of mixed results where you actually get better, or more unbiased judgments from elected judges in some places, and some places you get more. But I'll tell you, the first time I went to a partisan event in Texas, and I had a judge come up to me and hand me a piece of paper that said, "Hey, I'm Judge X. I'm going to judge this case this way, this case this way, this case this way, and this case this way. Here it's written right there. Vote for me. Please donate to my campaign." I was like, what? Right? But there's a lot of literature in there that shows that actually, like, voter preferences actually go into balancing out the court, and that most elected partisan judges actually do act more on precedent than partisan beliefs once they're actually elected, and that the partisan part is just part of the campaign because of the, so, I don't know.
We'll do one more question and we'll spend the night.
Let's go, Thomas.
All right. Oh, thanks for giving me the last question.
I could stay here forever.
Oh, okay. Well, then
You know, in China, they just released the first AI news reporter, right? So now he can follow you anywhere and report 24 hours a day, ever, forever, and ever.
that's super creepy.
Yeah.
So
watch
my
the video
question
online.
is,
It's creepier.
it's kind of two parts, I guess. So the first one is, capitalism is necessary but not sufficient for democracy, or
Yes.
so that's kind of contrary to the post-Cold War end of history
Yes.
idea that with globalization, democracy will follow. So my question flowing from that is, then what else do you need to make these more authoritarian governments that have adopted elements of capitalism, be it a Cuba or a China, or they even have markets in North Korea, become what you consider to be a democracy?
It's a very good question. Because the point is that capitalism is never going to bring about democracy in China. Only China is going to bring about democracy in China, if they want it. And I think one thing that we found in the post-Cold War era, so in World War II, right, we found that we actually could force democracy on people. Right? We conquered the Nazis, we conquered the Japanese, and we actually wrote the Japanese constitution and created a democracy there. We actually took over Germany and created we said, you people are not going to be expansionist military powers anymore. You're going to be democracies, you're going to be capitalists, and you're going to make some of the best goods in the world, and you're going to distribute them to everywhere. And it worked. And it was really expensive. And it took a long time, and it was a big bet that paid off, and paid off really well for the entire world because markets spread out from all of that all around the world. But then 9/11 happened, right, and then Iraq happened. And Iraq is still, I think we hang our heads low, like Iraq has been like this terrible, horrible mistake. But it's, it's been what, 17 or 15 years now. Like, how long was it since the fall of the Nazi regime until the reunification of Germany and then the growth of where it is today? Right? How long was it from the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Japan to the miracle of the 1980s and 90s when they started making all the awesome cars and spreading everything out? So I think Iraq is still a sort of open question, and I think that hanging our heads low about it is sort of not the right way to go about it. But it's also not the right way to go around forcing democracy on everybody around the world, right? It's not terribly efficient. It's really expensive. It takes a really long time. It kills a lot of people. It creates a lot of heartache. It creates inefficiencies into markets. It's just not. It's not really the best solution. So other than that solution, I think the way that you go about doing it is setting up incentivization structures. It's all about incentives, right, for people to want to join. Right, so since the United States and Germany and Japan and Europe and now India and Australia have built this global financial democratic capitalist market around the world, and we've invited in all these authoritarian countries around the world. We've entangled ourselves with them, with their markets. Now they know, right, the global capitalism has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and made their lives better all around the world, right? So it's time to sort of pump the brakes a little bit and focus on those like-minded countries and other democracies and strengthening them and helping their markets, helping our own markets, connecting them together to incentivize other countries to want to do it themselves. Because there's no cultural argument against democracy. I can't stand that argument when people say that you can't have democracy in Muslim countries or you can't have democracy in Asian countries. We went through this whole thing of like Asian values and the Islam thing, and I just can't stand that argument because democracy looks different everywhere, and it's different, and cultures are different everywhere too. But I always give the example of Korea, right, where you do this artificial line along the parallel, and you build different institutions on either side. You have one ethnicity, one language, one religion, one everything. You had two very different outcomes. You had South Korea eventually developed into one of the wealthiest, most powerful regional democracies next to Japan right there. And then you have North Korea turned into this hermit kingdom where people are starving to death and there's threat of war every day, right? That's institutions, that's incentivization. Institutions are all about incentivizing people. So there can be democracy everywhere. But so one way is to force it by gun, but that's not efficient and too expensive. And so the best way is to incentivize it.
So this is like a John McCain League of Democracies type idea, or like a
Yes.
European Union.
Yes. John McCain had a wonderful, came up, but it was never really developed. We do have a League of Democracies today, or it's called what's it called? A concert of democracies, or the community of democracies, right? But like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia are in it. So it has some problems. And I've written some stuff about this too as well. There has to be an incentivization to join the club. There has to be a sort of club, but it shouldn't be a security club. We have NATO, we have all the democracy security clubs that we need out there. Nuclear weapons and all that type of stuff, right? Make it that we don't want conflict, right? Like no great power conflict, right? We don't want the jungle to grow back or any of that stuff, right? We don't want to go back to our caves and have to hide for 20 years until we come out. But so you want to reduce you want to make it a community that's an economic community, I think, and that's how you incentivize it, because we have this global economy, and you could do it. You could leverage the elections as well.
Okay, well, not to hug all the questions, but then to get on that point, it's like if these authoritarian regimes are already stealing from their own people, in your selectorate theory discussion, why would they have an incentive to try to be part of that club?
To move to a thing where to move to a system where they could have a chance of being in that winning coalition. Right, so if they, say Iran, for example, right, has a small winning coalition with the Ayatollah up there with massive amounts of corruption there. If the people decide that they want to create a system that has a larger winning coalition with a leadership that has to get loyalty from a larger number of people, then they're going to be better off in the long run, because they're going to get better public policies, they're going to get better national defense, they're going to get better all this education policy, transportation policy, transparency, all the stuff that they get from having that. And so if they want to do that, then they can do that themselves. And the United States and the West should stand ready to help anybody that asks for it or wants it. But yeah, that's why people would be incentivized for it, because you're better off. But those small groups, they're not better off. They're worse off by it. So this is what entrenches them, right? The North Korean regime knows that if the regime changes, I mean, if you get into the term limits problem in Africa, right, with a lot of these countries where the leaders who took over after independence then abolished term limits, because they commit all these atrocities while they're in office, and then they know from looking around at what happened to all the rest of the other people who committed atrocities and then left office, they got hung. Right? Their families got killed. All their stuff got stolen and redistributed to everybody else. They faced these horrible outcomes. And so the entrenched singular groups have a huge incentive to maintain the status quo and to not change. So it becomes like a domestic battle. This is where I get into like the comparative politics of international relations. Right? It's about studying what's going on inside these countries, because it's a battle between these people who are entrenched in the center and the rest. Whereas in democracies like the United States or France or wherever, it's this big, public, transparent battle where you know, calling each other's news organizations corrupt or arguing about you know, real estate deals and all sorts of sex scandals after sex scandal after sex scandal and stuff, right? But in these other countries, it's life or death, right? Because the inner communist party. This is what the literature talks about, this move towards personalization, right? Putin. The big question is, what is Putin going to do in 2024? Right? Because either he's going to have to abolish term limits in Russia. He's done a lot of stuff. He's killed a lot of reporters. He's annexed Crimea. He's started a bunch of stuff with a lot of people and opposition groups in Russia that are going to cause him a lot of problems in the 2024 election, which will be the end of effectively his 5th term. But his second set of 2 terms. So according to the Constitution now, he can't stay in power. What's he going to do in 2024? Well, everybody who really looks at it, when I look at it, he's either going to amend the Constitution, but that's going to really make everybody angry in Russia that thinks that they have a chance at maybe moving towards this other type of system. So he might not do that. And if he doesn't do that, he's going to try to pick a successor that he can use as a puppet to continue ruling the country. But at some point, that puppet's going to realize that, hey, I have the power to distribute these goods now. And then what's Putin going to do? Because then that puppet gets the power and starts going after Putin and his family and everybody else, right? So it becomes this dilemma it's just very predictable, and it's country by country by country where they're non-democratic. These middling countries are the ones where I think we should be focusing because they're the ones, Central America, Mexico, Latin America, Colombia. That's where we should be investing and helping them build their democracies while focusing on cleaning up ours at home. Ours could use a lot of work as well. But yeah, but corruption has to be the sort of issue of it. And hopefully we can have a clearer understanding of what it is as we try to do it.
All right. Well, for the Alexander Hamilton Society and on behalf of the AEI Executive Council, I'd like to thank Dr. Fuller for coming tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So we're all set. Feel free to go whenever you'd like, but if you're willing to stay around and chat.
Yeah, I'm willing to stick around
a few
for
thoughts. But thank you very much for coming.
And we're playing good to see.
And grab some pizza on the way up, seriously.
So you brought up divorce several times, and I think that's
Oh, for Thanksgiving. Would you say? Yeah.
but,
Picture?